First and foremost, I want to thank you so much for taking out the time to come on the platform. I really appreciate the work that you're doing, and I look
Thank you.
forward to hearing more about it.
Thank you.
Definitely, definitely. For the viewers who may not recognize you, let them know who you are, where you're from, and definitely what do you do.
All right. Well, hello everybody. My name is Simon Howard. I am an assistant professor of psychology at University of Miami. I have my PhD in social psychology, and basically I study the underlying psychological processes of racism. I'm very interested in understanding these processes because I feel that the best way to basically address and dismantle racism is first understanding it, definitely from a psychological perspective. I'm from, I say I'm from Santa Cruz. I was born in a small desert town called Brawley, California, Imperial Valley. But I always say like I'm from Santa Cruz because like that's where I raised. I feel like my memories and uh, formative years kind of happened there. So Santa Cruz, California. Um, yeah, that's where I'm from. A little bit about me.
Wow. Okay. Okay. I take my hat off to you. Definitely. You got to be intelligent to get into that field and courageous as well. So I want to know, when did you develop this passion for psychology and racism in particular? Was it something you were into as a young child, or did you get into it later in life? Do you have psychologists in your family?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. Trying to figure out like where was like my entry point into psychology. I would argue that everybody is a lay psychologist, right? We're always trying to make sense of our worlds. We're always trying to make sense of why are the people around us doing what they're doing, why they think what they think, why they feel what they feel. We're very introspective. We're always then questioning, well, at least some of us question why it is we think we did something or why we're thinking a certain way, making sense of our lives around us, right? And the people around us. Um, so I would say like that's embedded in all of us to some extent. What I guess took me to this trajectory of like trying to do this as a career path. I think, I was entering undergrad, San Jose State University, first generation college student. So no one in my family was a psychologist. So it wasn't like that aspect, but I think family had a lot to do with it, right? Like trying to figure out like my family, like what's going on, why we do certain things we do, why I did certain things we did. And so I was always inherently interested in humans, human behavior, right? Just like always. And so when I got to college, I didn't know what major I really necessarily wanted to do because there were so many, right? And I went through that enrollment, like major enrollment, and I was like looking through reading, starting from accounting and uh, astrological physics. I'm going through, and I got the psychology, and I read it, and it just jumped out at me. I'm like, oh, like trying to understand human behavior and the mind, and description. I'm like, this is what I think I want to do. So yeah, and I just started taking courses and to be honest, the first few courses I did take of psychology, I did not like. I was like, maybe I picked the wrong field, but I took two classes that sort of, I think, forever put me on this path. And one of them was a social psychology class, which is what I am today. And that was a branch of psychology that focuses on how the context and situations influence human behavior rather than a focus on someone's disposition. So we social psychologists will ask the question, what is it about this situation that influences many people in the same way if they found themselves in this same situation versus other branches of psychology might ask the question, what is it about this person that makes them behave this way across various contexts? Because that's just the type of person they are. And what I felt like at the time was that social psychology was like the optimist um, branch, right? Because it leaves open the possibility that if we can change something about this context or something about this situation, we can influence people's behavior and in my mindset for the better. So right, so it's like I understand these things influence these people to do, um, let's say, if we're gonna put like a valence on behavior, more negative aspects. What is it that we can do to try to create a situation or context that would promote more positive behaviors?
Okay, okay. Now I can ask you this. Now, what courses in particular do you teach, and how receptive are the students to this in 2024? You speaking about psychology and racism. Are they all kind of on one accord, or is it kind of like split down the middle in terms of trying to figure out, I guess, the psychological aspects of it?
Yeah, that's a great question too. It's mixed, I would, to be honest, right? And I can only, I guess, speak across two institutions that I've taught at, but I think just given similarities across this demographic of students that I'm teaching, so it's college students. Um, One institution was more predominantly white than the other, so like that's where I'm at. Where I feel like other institutions, if you're at HBCUs or if it's a Hispanic serving institution, may look different. Um, but yeah, so I teach social psychology, broad social or broad survey course introducing people to the branch of social psychology. So we cover topics from attraction, stereotyping, prejudice, pro-social behavior, conformity, so on and so forth. Basically, like the human experience is covered in that course. We touch on various topics. So not much big pushback there because we don't really dive in it too deeply. Although I try to sprinkle it throughout so they don't just get it at one chapter because those things can be talked about across all chapters. Um, but the psychology of racism course I teach, and psychology of prejudice, which is prejudice more broadly across various dimensions of diversity, it depends of the makeup of the students in the class. Now, most of the time, the students that are taking these courses, they're self-selected because these are upper division courses. So a person who looks at that class and may not believe that racism is a problem today, they probably ain't even going to sign up for the class because that would go for a very different experience if they in the class and trying to derail conversations. And in some ways, sometimes I wish they were in the class so it just provide for a more rich experience in terms of people debating, because the people who are self-selecting to take my courses, I would generally assume that they're already sort of at the baseline racism exists, right? That ain't even up for debate, right? It's like the psychology of racism. Um, but despite that, though, depending on certain times that I've taught the class, it's been very interesting uh, with what students are bringing into the class. I feel like when you talk about racism, it's like almost teaching a new language because some people just don't have that language to talk about racism. It's like, how are we even defining racism to begin with? And if people are coming in with 16 different definitions of racism, or 30, however big the class is, we having 30 different conversations because some people only think about it from an interpersonal perspective. Other people are including other dimensions of someone's identity and calling that racism. Like someone was mentioning like religion in one of my classes at one point, and although sometimes like religious affiliation could be a proxy for race, I don't think that's what they were talking about. And so like one of the first things I do is I have people write your definition of racism, and then we ball them up, throw them all across the room, and then people pick them up, and then you see everybody talking or has a different definition of racism. And I said, well, this is how we define it in this class. And I always define racism as white supremacy, right? From the aspect from an interpersonal power relationship, but also from an institutional, systemic aspect. And so we have levels to racism that can be either interpersonal or systemic. And so I'm saying for the basis of this class, when we having a conversation, this is the definition we start from. You don't necessarily have to agree with it, but when we're using and talking about it, we at least all know what we're talking about. And then you can discuss why you may agree or disagree with the definition, but how we talking about it here Is this the definition we're using? And so sometimes you get some pushback or people uncomfortable with that terminology of white supremacy, right? And I always tell people, and the code word for white people, it's an ideology, which means anybody can adopt an ideology the same ways people can adopt conservatism or liberalism or things like that. So I'm like, you know, African people can adopt a white supremacist ideology to the detriment to themselves, but still they can adopt it. Any racial ethnic group can, right? Um, and so I think when you start introducing these things, you get some people who are uncomfortable with these terms. So it's been a mix, right? Like there's been some people who are like been very open and having a conversation, and I think most of them are because they signed up for the class. And then sometimes you will get like some pushback, or but that's what it is for. Like I always tell the students in the class that there are oftentimes you'll be in this class and you might be uncomfortable. And these levels of discomfort, ask yourself why. So do that internal work. And then two, a lot of the biggest opportunities for growth will come in your experience of this discomfort. Um, and the other aspect is that we're not necessarily having these conversations outside of this context in this type of space in this way. And so also have latitude with one another to be ignorant, because this is where only one person in the room got a PhD on this, and that's me. And I say, and even I'm still continually learning. It's not a destination; it's a continual journey. Because even the way in which we think about and talk about these things sometimes has changed. Even the language around how we discuss or how we refer to people and identify folks, right? Um, yeah. So it's never a dull moment in these classes. Most of the times, I think it has gone well. Like I haven't had any instances of a lot of like tension, but every now and then there has been, right? Like there was a woman arguing in one of my classes on why she didn't think blackface was an a problem, wasn't problematic. And that was an interesting conversation to be having in the class. And then, breaking down like one aspect, history is also very important. And then it's not a history class, but we have to historicize racism within a context of psychology, because I think sometimes my one of my biggest criticisms of psychology as a discipline is ahistorical sometimes. And I think when you're dealing with topics such as racism, um, that we have to contextualize and historicize the things that we are studying or looking at or trying to understand in points of time, like what's going on or what was going on, or what is the overall social political context of a country or a state.
Yeah, man, that really sounds interesting. But like you say, is you constantly learning, you constantly growing, and people coming in at different levels. Some people done lived it and experienced it, and some
Right.
people come from areas where they probably may not even have encountered other races. If they
Yep.
just being honest, and you know, but that's good though. That's real cool. Now I wanted to ask you about this, the Pride Research Lab. Now, is that connected with that, or is that something different?
Right. So yeah, I'm the director of the Pride Lab. It stands for the Psychology of Racism, Identity, Diversity, and Equity Lab. So as faculty members, professors, we often have two roles, um, depending on the institution. But many institutions are research-oriented institutions, which means that faculty are responsible for doing research, roughly 50% of the time, and then teaching the other like 50. Those percentages kind of shift. I feel like sometimes the research is 60, teaching is 50, and then they got you doing service, which is 20. And I know that don't add up to 100, but that's my point. It's just we always is doing something that's busy. But yeah, so in my lab, this is where I'm conducting research studies and experiments trying to address these questions, right? So we use in psychology the scientific method to test our assumptions, test research questions that we have. Yeah, and that's what the lab does.
Wow. Okay. Okay. Now, I don't know if you free to talk about it, but what type of experiments do you do, and what type of research do you do? You know,
Yeah,
like do
so
you? Okay.
yeah, most of my lab, right? Because racism broad topic. So what have I primarily focused on? It's mainly three areas, right? I have an interest in the relationship between religiosity and how that maintains uh, social hierarchies, and that hierarchy being racism. And I primarily focused on Christianity and religious deities. So, how do people imagine uh, and believe in religious deities? So, we anthropomorphize gods, and people typically think about personality traits, right? So how do we conceptualize God? God is either benevolent and loving, or maybe he's punishing um, for some people, right? So everyone can, let's say, not everyone, but those who do believe in God all believe in God, but the way they conceptualize God might be different. And another way in which we anthropomorphize gods is by giving them other human characteristics like gender and race. And so it's like white God, that's the most prevailing image that we see depicted, if God is given race, right? And in Jesus as well. And so I'm interested in, does that mean something? Does that predict people's attitudes? What influence does that have on individuals, right? Those who've been historically advantaged in our society, so white people, and those who've been historically disadvantaged, so non-white folks, but typically black folks in my research. Does that impact? And so that's some of the work that I've done, and I've done it in various ways. I've exposed people to images of white Christ versus black Christ and other uh, images that relate to Christianity, and then subsequently ask them questions, right? Does this exposure influence their racial attitudes? And found that those who've been exposed to white images of Christ versus different images, it does shift their racial attitudes. And they tend to have more um, symbolically more negative anti-black attitudes, right? So it's a way in which we're addressing people's or assessing people's racial attitudes in a more indirect way. So you're not flat out asking them, "Do you like black people?" Right? Because most people, although that might be changing with this recent political landscape, people got the license, I guess, to say things that they may have not have expressed, even if they felt it. But typically, folks don't explicitly express racial prejudice, right? Because that's like taboo in our society. So there's ways in which in our experience we try to indirectly tap that. And so across my studies, I've seen that. So those who've been exposed to images of a white Christ versus other images have increased anti-black attitudes. I've done studies with black individuals where we've done similar things where we've exposed them to different images of Christ portrayed as different races. And what we've seen is that for black people, they start implicitly associating more positive attributes to white people than they do black people, right? Um, and there'll be more negative attributes associated with black people relative to white people. So on this implicit measure, we see some of these associations based off exposure to images of a white Christ. Um, right, and I think some of the implications is that it has a, I haven't yet did these studies, but I'm thinking that if for black people specifically, and maybe other non-white individuals, like when you're constantly exposed to images of the deity who's all powerful, all knowing, and that's being associated with whiteness, then that might lead to a whole host of other things. You might be less likely to want to challenge white authority because that's being associated with whiteness, because the most authoritative figure in people's worldview, if they believe in God, is God, and that's being associated with whiteness. Um, People may think that those who are most fit for leadership positions are white people. And some researchers out of Stanford actually did some work looking at that. If people believe that God is a white man, they think that white men are the most fit for leadership relative to other racial ethnic groups and genders. And so I think when we take this body of research together, it kind of provides evidence that yes, the way in which we imagine deities, or that if we're exposed to these deities, does have some effect on both white people and non-white folks.
Yeah, most definitely it do, man. Man,
Right.
that's deep right there. Kind of remind me. I don't know if you remember the Good Times episode back in the day
Yeah.
when Mike he took the white Jesus off the wall. Florida wasn't having it.
Right. That's not my Jesus. That's so funny because all right, so some people ain't familiar with good times. When I do my presentations on this work, right, in various spaces, and then it's interesting that how because well, let me back up. Religion is one of those things that is still practiced typically within race. People want to worship on average with people of their same racial background. I think Malcolm or Martin, I can't remember which one it was, said like the most segregated hour is high noon on Sunday or something, right? Like, because people typically want to practice religion, or I don't want to say want, but they do. And so people in these talks are they're always assuming, right? If they're white, they're assuming that black people have their own set of religious iconography. And I was like, like, but the history of colonization is that when people have, sort of forced or imposed Christianity on whoever they're enslaving or subjugating, a religion that's adopted is typically a Eurocentric form of Christianity, which means that those individuals who were either enslaved or colonized, their images mirror those of their former oppressors. Um, and so I was like, no, like you can go to many predominantly black churches and you'll still see predominantly white religious iconography. Um, and I think people just assume like there was just two sets of images of Christ and God out there. Um, and then that's what I bring in the Good Times episode. Like I usually show a little clip, and it's that because this is the prevailing image, some people are still like very deeply tied to that image, even if they are black. People are like, oh, and then for some people, it's like I just blow their mind with that clip because they ain't familiar with Good Times. But it's just showing like, yeah, this if that's all you've ever known, then that's what you've associated with God and Christ. So you might have a deep attachment to that image. But yeah, that scene, that I love that scene only because it's like I've been able to use it to kind of because people sometimes need a visual representation. I'll be talking and I'm like, oh yeah, but look, this has been something that was shown in a sitcom from decades ago, thinking about these same things. I'm looking at it now within an academic psychological perspective, but the commentary has been there like since forever, you know.
Yeah, definitely. Like you say, the representation is important, and that's definitely a major part of it. But it make me think also about like you ever see the Barbie doll test, and it's like
Yeah,
they did it back in the day, maybe 100 years ago, 50 years ago, but
yeah,
they do it today. They have some black kids, African American kids, and they may have some white children, then they have
yeah,
like some Latino children, and I'm like, which doll is the ugly doll? Which doll is the dumb doll? Which
yeah,
doll is the mean doll? And then everybody unanimously say the black, but then when it gets to the black children, they're like, well, which doll look like you? Then it's
you.
like they having a meltdown, like, oh, I'm the black doll, or
Yeah,
then
that's me.
the Latino children, they kind of like, they in the middle, like they don't know which, and then the white children is like, we white, but they only like 5 years old and they
Right.
understand this.
Already having those, and that's to me like I haven't done research with children yet, right? And I feel like that's but research they've done studies, even like the one you're describing now, that colloquially known like as a doll test, from two black social psychologists actually came with that. Actually, one was maybe developmental, but Kenneth Clark and his wife Mamie Clark, they're the ones who initially did those studies, right? And as you said, it was done so many years ago, like 1950s, 1940s, I think, when those first studies. You do them today, you see those same patterns, right? And I show those studies are those because they've been filmed, right? And I show those things too because one, I'm again, it's like I'm telling a story, but then visually seen, and like I can't directly argue that this is a result of religion. I don't or Christianity, and I wouldn't do that, right? I feel like there's positive and negative aspects of like most things, religion as well. But what I do is get people to think about this thought experiment, particularly for Black folks. Who's the most religious group in the United States? Black people. We grow up in the church. Before a kid can even say the Jesus name, like they already have a visual representation of who Jesus is before they're even able to say like his name. And so as a kid, right? Because you're saying these kids that are doing this test are 4 and 5. Yes. I'm not saying religion is the sole contributor, but it's often left out of the conversation. People turn to media and like education and school and parents, but in part, this is also learned from church because kids are meaning makers. Like I think sometimes we underestimate how well or how much kids are making meaning of their lives, right? And it is like taking things in, observing. So since the moment they're born, they're being taken to church. They're now being exposed to these images, and they're seeing that all these people that are associated with heaven and things that are good do not look like them. The stained glass windows got white angels. We're the black angels. Jesus and God, again, all knowing, all powerful, white. And so when I go and look at a doll, which one's the good doll? There's been this ongoing narrative that's been playing. Doesn't even need to be said explicitly, but it's implicitly being right. Because again, it's like we're being told, like, oh, if you are good, you go where? Heaven. If you're bad, where do you end up? Hell. Now I'm looking around, I'm like, well, if all these are representations of those that have made it to heaven, where are the little black angels at? They don't got no black angels in heaven. I don't see myself in heaven. Oh, that's the bad one. That's the bad doll. And so, yeah, I think in part, religion explains some of that. I wouldn't say, again, I would never say all of it, but I think that's the insidious nature of white supremacy, though, right? Communicating this idea of white superiority and black inferiority across many different contexts. Religion is one of those potentially that does that. In addition, with media and watered down forms of history that are being pushed, especially heavily recently across some states, the state that I'm in currently. And so these narratives, right? And if you're being bombarded with this every day, I look at those doll studies and look at like, well, how would we expect them to answer any other way? Unless you are actively creating a counter narrative. But white supremacy don't take days off, right? So it's going. So it becomes like an automatic reflex almost. And so it's like, well, you got black daughters, sons, you better be having ways in which you're constructing a narrative that goes against that because they're going to be bombarded with that on the daily. Right? Like I remember my sister was doing like self affirmations with her daughter, just like in the mirror, talking about, reinforcing positive ideas about hair, skin tone, color, things like that, where it's like, yeah, because as soon as you don't do that, there's going to be millions of other information that's being transmitted explicitly, implicitly, telling her otherwise.
Yeah, true indeed, true indeed. That's a great idea too. Now, I just want to ask you one more question. Now, have you thought about doing any books or documentaries, based upon the research that you have been doing?
Yeah, that's I want to say one more thing. So the other research I'm doing right now that's I'm building on. It hasn't, like, I haven't yet published in this. Actually, I did get something accepted recently, but it's not out yet. I'm interested in vicarious experiences of racism, because we know a lot about like direct experiences. So if I'm experiencing racism directly, but just given the advent of, technology, the internet, and how widespread social media is, a lot of what we're experiencing in terms of like racism often happens indirectly now, vicariously. And so if I see some incident of someone being targeted because of their race, or killed, or experiencing some sort of harassment, what impact may that have on my mental and physical health? So yeah, wanted to also add like this other things that I do, but books. So yeah, I would love to write a book, right? I would love to write a book. I thought about documentaries and things like that. Like I just haven't yet, I think, had the time to focus on that, just given the structure of academia, and how you get promoted and what's incentivized and what's not, and what the structure is and what's sort of valued within the discipline. Not saying they don't value books, but we're more in psychology, expected to write research articles that get published. And then so it's like a series of articles. And that's what's going to get you tenure, right? And that's something that academics are always like trying to secure, because it's basically job security. But then if you don't get tenure at the institution you're at, basically you're fired, and then you have to try to find a new job, right? So you get like 6 years to do it. So you're on a 6 year probationary period, give or take a year, depending on the institution. And so it's like if my livelihood's tied to that, I'm going to prioritize publishing articles, because a book's not going to give me tenure. It may give me other type of fulfillment, right? Like disseminated people tend to probably read books more. It's written in a way that's probably more accessible for the general public. Um, I'll probably get invited to like talk more places. I think it's just, yeah, having a book form, it will allow me a little more freedom and more length. But that's the main reason why I haven't. I want to, I probably will, uh, but it won't be for a few years. But yeah.
Okay, okay, man. I understand you got to do what you got to do. I really appreciate everything that you're doing. This is really some heavy information. I'm still processing a lot of the stuff that you were saying, and I do look forward to the work that you have coming in the future, man. So I want to thank you so much for taking out the time to stop by, and definitely thank the viewers for tuning in as well.
Oh yeah, thank you for having me. And I appreciate what you're doing. I checked out the channel. So it's work. I know it's not easy, like hosting a series like this, and I know the editing on the back end, and uh, reaching out to folks, and people will, slow to respond, myself included. I apologize. But yeah, so I appreciate what you're doing as well.
Yeah, yeah, it's all good, man.